My niece had always been a talker. From the moment she learned words, Ivy never stopped using them. She'd narrate everything: what the dog was doing, what color the sky was, why she thought broccoli was invented by people who hated children. At 5 years old, she had opinions about everything and no internal filter whatsoever. So when she went quiet at my brother's 4th of July cookout, I noticed immediately. I'm a high school history teacher in Denver. 43 years old, divorced, no kids of my own. My brother Nathan and I grew up close. Irish Catholic family from Aurora, the kind where you showed up to every birthday, every holiday, every graduation, whether you wanted to or not. We weren't always friends as adults, but we were family, and family meant something to us. At least, I thought it did. Nathan married Gwen 6 years ago. I liked her well enough at first. She was organized, put together, the kind of woman who sent thank you cards within 48 hours. When Ivy was born, she seemed like a devoted mother, but somewhere around Ivy's 3rd birthday, things started shifting in ways I couldn't quite name. The visits got shorter, the excuses multiplied. The family dinners that used to stretch past midnight started ending at 8 o'clock sharp. That July 4th, I'd been watching Ivy for maybe 20 minutes before I realized something was wrong. She wasn't running around with the other kids. She wasn't asking me to push her on the tire swing like she always did. She was sitting at the edge of the patio, knees pulled to her chest, watching the backyard with the kind of stillness that doesn't belong on a 5-year-old. "Hey, Bug," I said, dropping into the chair beside her. "You feeling okay?" She looked at me for a second before looking away again. "I'm fine, Uncle Ray." She didn't sound fine. She sounded like she was reciting the right answer. I glanced over at Nathan, who was standing by the grill with the beer, laughing at something his neighbor said. Gwen was inside. I could see her through the kitchen window, moving around, arranging something. I turned back to Ivy. "You want to go see the fireflies later? I brought that mason jar you liked." Something flickered in her expression. Not excitement, exactly. More like she almost let herself feel something before she pulled it back. "Maybe," she said. Then Gwen appeared at the sliding glass door. "Ivy, come help me with the potato salad." Ivy stood immediately. No negotiating. No, in a minute. She just stood up and went inside, her small shoulders set like a person preparing for something. I sat there for a moment trying to figure out why watching a 5-year-old carry potato salad made my stomach tighten. That night, after the fireworks, I was helping clean up in the backyard when I heard Ivy inside. Not words, just a sound. It was a quiet, thin sound. The kind kids make when they're trying not to cry and not quite succeeding. I went through the sliding door and found her in the hallway outside the bathroom, her arms wrapped around herself. "Bug, what's wrong?" She shook her head fast. "Ivy, look at me." I crouched down to her level. "You can tell me." She looked up at me and then quickly looked past me toward the stairs, making sure no one was there. A 5-year-old checking over my shoulder. "The workshop scares me," she whispered. "The workshop?" Nathan had converted the detached garage into a woodworking shop a few years back. He refinished furniture, made cutting boards, stuff like that. Sold some pieces on Etsy. It was his hobby, his retreat. "Why does the workshop scare you, honey?" She pressed her lips together so hard they went white. "Ivy, it's okay. I'm not going to be mad." "Daddy said I can't talk about it." Her voice was almost inaudible. "He said if I tell, something bad will happen to Mommy." I felt the hallway go cold. Before I could say anything else, I heard Nathan's footsteps on the deck. Ivy straightened up instantly, wiping her face with her sleeve, and by the time my brother pushed open the sliding door, she looked almost normal. Almost. "There she is," Nathan said, easy and warm, the good dad voice. "Ready to get to bed, sweet pea?" "Yes, Daddy," she said, and she walked right past me to him, not looking back. I drove home that night and I couldn't stop replaying it. The way she'd checked over my shoulder, the workshop, the threat about something happening to Mommy. I'd been teaching teenagers for nearly 20 years. I knew the difference between a dramatic kid and a scared kid. Ivy hadn't been dramatic. She'd been careful, deliberately, consciously careful, the way children become when someone has taught them that words have consequences. I got home at midnight and didn't sleep. I'm not an investigator. I'm not law enforcement. What I am is the person who taught an entire unit on identifying authoritarian control systems every fall semester. And the thing about recognizing patterns of power and silencing is that once you know how they work, you can't unsee them. Every interaction I could remember from the past year started reshuffling in my head. Ivy's increasingly muted behavior at family events. The way Nathan and Gwen had stopped letting her stay over at my place before. She'd spent practically every other weekend with me. The new deadbolt on the garage that hadn't been there last Thanksgiving. The fact that no one had been in Nathan's workshop since he'd been working on a big project. The workshop had a lock. It had a lock on the outside. I kept coming back to that. By Tuesday, I'd called in a personal day. I knew Nathan's schedule. He was a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, traveled 3 days a week. He'd flown to Houston that morning. I'd checked his LinkedIn, which still showed his work travel schedule in his posts. I know that's pathetic. I know how it looks. But when you're turning over the same terrible thought in your mind for 4 consecutive nights, you stop worrying about how things look. Gwen took Ivy to day camp every morning at 8:15. I parked 2 streets over and watched the minivan pull out of the driveway at 8:22. Then I sat there for another 15 minutes, engine off, hands on the steering wheel, trying to talk myself out of what I was about to do. I couldn't. I knew where they kept the spare key. Back when Nathan and I were actually close, he'd shown me the magnetic box under the back deck railing. It was still there. I let myself in through the back door and stood in the kitchen listening to the empty house for a full minute. The door to the garage was in the mudroom off the kitchen. It had a regular handle on the inside, but I already knew there was a deadbolt on the exterior. When I tried the handle, it was locked from the kitchen side too. A padlock, new, fastened through a hasp that had been screwed into the doorframe recently enough that the paint around the screws was still slightly uneven. Who padlocks a woodworking shop from the inside of their own house? I found the key in the 3rd drawer I checked. A kitchen junk drawer, behind a takeout menus and spare batteries. 2 keys on a plain ring, no label. The padlock clicked open. The smell hit me before I'd even found the light switch. Not chemicals, not wood. Something older and more closed in, like a room where the air had been still for a long time. I found the pole chain for the overhead light, and the room came into focus. The workbench was there. The band saw, the table saw, the organized pegboard of tools. On the surface, it looked like a normal garage shop, but the windows were covered, not with curtains or blinds, with sheets of black foam board, the heavy-duty kind, cut precisely to fit each frame and sealed around the edges with weather stripping. I walked over and pressed my hand against the nearest panel. It didn't shift. It had been secured from behind with brackets. In the corner, I almost didn't see it at first because it was pushed partly behind a rolling cabinet. A folding cot, child-sized sleeping bag on top, the pink kind with cartoon foxes on it. I recognized it because I'd given it to Ivy for Christmas 2 years ago. I'd bought it for camping trips we were going to take. We never did. A plastic bin under the cot held a change of clothes. Ivy's clothes. I stood there for a long time before I could make myself keep looking. On a shelf above the workbench, behind a row of paint cans, a laptop, sealed in a Ziploc bag, a portable external hard drive, and a cheap flip phone, the kind you buy prepaid. I didn't touch any of it. I just stood there with my phone out taking pictures of everything. The sealed windows, the cot, the clothes, the electronics, the padlock hardware on the inside of the door. Then I opened the cabinet the cot had been pushed against. I'd like to tell you I handled what I saw in there well. I didn't. I had to step outside and stand on the driveway in the morning sun for a while, breathing, before I could go back in. I won't describe everything in detail, partly because I still can't think about it clearly, and partly because once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. And I'd rather spare you the specific weight of that. What I'll say is this. What was inside that cabinet made the purpose of that room unmistakable, and it had been going on long enough that some of what I found was dated, not metaphorically but literally dated. Nathan had written dates on things. He had organized it. He had Graken's dates on things. He had organized it. He had kept records. My daughter. I kept thinking that even though Ivy wasn't my daughter. 3 years, she had just turned 5. I photographed everything, locked the cabinet, relocked the padlock, put the keys back in the drawer, and drove directly to the Denver Police Department's Child Crimes Unit. I won't romanticize what happened next by pretending it went smoothly. It didn't. The detective I spoke with first, a younger guy, looked like he'd been on the job maybe 3 years, was professionally skeptical in a way that felt like a wall. I was a man claiming his brother was abusing his 5-year-old niece based on a conversation in a hallway and a locked garage. I understood the skepticism. I didn't have to like it. I asked to speak with a supervisor. Her name was Detective Lorraine Voss. She was probably 55, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular stillness of someone who has heard a lot of terrible things and learned not to show all of them on her face at once. I told her everything, start to finish, while she took notes without interrupting. When I was done, she looked at my phone photos for a long time without speaking. "Tell me about the cot," she said. "How certain are you that's your niece's sleeping bag?" "I bought it December before last, Target, the one on Colorado Boulevard. It's the Arctic Fox Jr. series. I can find the receipt." She studied my face. "Mr. Calloway, Ray Calloway. Mr. Calloway. The entry to that garage. How did you get in?" I told her the truth. All of it. She sat back and was quiet for a moment. "What you did opens up complications. You know that." "I know. I needed you to believe me first. I can deal with the complications." Another pause. Then she turned to the officer standing near the door. "Get me Beaumont, and call CPS." Things accelerated after that in a way that felt both too fast and too slow. I gave a formal statement, twice. I handed over my phone for imaging. I was told to stay available and not to contact Nathan or Gwen or go near their property. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table with the overhead light on, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except Ivy at that July 4th cookout. The way she'd looked at me with nothing behind her eyes. The warrant came through the following morning. They arrested Nathan at Denver International Airport before his return flight. From what I was told later, he didn't say anything at first. Then he asked for his lawyer, and after that he didn't say anything at all. Gwen was taken into custody at the house. She collapsed on the front porch apparently, which the neighbors witnessed. I heard about that through my mother, who heard about it from the woman next door who'd been watching from across the street. Ivy was at day camp. A child protective services worker and a trained family advocate picked her up there. The camp director had been called in advance. They took her somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar looking, and explained as gently as you can explain something like that to a 5-year-old that she wasn't going home that night. She asked if her daddy was coming. She was told no. She asked if she was in trouble. She was told she had done nothing wrong. Then she sat very still for a while. And then she asked if she could have a juice box. I wasn't there for any of this. I pieced it together over weeks from the CPS worker assigned to Ivy's case, a woman named Bev Okafor, who had the patience of someone who had chosen difficult work and made peace with it. Bev told me things slowly, in installments, as they were confirmed and as they were deemed appropriate for me to know. What the initial medical examination revealed, what Ivy had disclosed in her forensic interview, in the measured language of a child who had been told silence was survival. The investigation took 6 weeks to complete before charges were formally filed. In that time, Ivy was placed with my parents. My mother and father, both in their 60s, suddenly had a 5-year-old in the house again. My father rearranged his woodworking hobby. He also had a shop, a real one, nothing like what Nathan had built, to be completely off limits until Ivy said it was okay with her. He told her she got to decide. She never asked about it, but she seemed to understand that she had been given the power to say no to a space and that was allowed. My mother called me every day. Sometimes she cried. Mostly she was furious in the quiet, cold way. She'd always been furious when things were unjust. A stillness in her voice that was somehow worse than shouting. "How did I not know?" she said once. "I saw them every month. How did I sit across from him and not know?" I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't. I was approved for supervised visits with Ivy after 8 weeks. The first visit was at the Family Advocacy Center off Colfax. A building designed to not look like a building where hard things happen, with soft furniture and a fish tank and windows that let in a lot of light. A therapist named Dr. Reyes sat nearby, not intrusive, just present. Ivy walked in wearing a yellow shirt I hadn't seen before, her hair in two slightly crooked pigtails that my mother had clearly attempted. She looked around the room first. That same sweeping, cautious look I'd noticed at the cookout, checking the perimeter. And then she saw me and her face did something complicated. She walked over slowly and stood in front of me. "Hi, Bug," I said. "Hi, Uncle Ray." She sat down next to me on the couch and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I told about the workshop." "You did. You were very brave." "Daddy said something bad would happen if I told." "I know he said that. But nothing bad happened. You're here. Your grandma and grandpa are here. I'm here." She thought about this. Daddy was wrong. Daddy was wrong. Daddy was very, very wrong. She nodded slowly, like she was filing this away. Then she asked if I still had the mason jar, because she wanted to catch fireflies when it was warm again. I said yes. I told her we'd go as soon as she was ready. I didn't cry until I got to my car. The legal process was as ugly as Detective Voss had warned me it would be. Nathan's attorney, a criminal defense lawyer from a firm in Cherry Creek, the kind of firm that advertises on bus stops, argued that the evidence obtained during my unauthorized entry was tainted and should be excluded. The judge disagreed. The forensic evidence from the warrant-based search of the garage was substantial and stood entirely on its own. What I'd photographed was ultimately supplementary. The defense also argued that Ivy's disclosure had been coached. A forensic psychologist testified at length about the specific characteristics of Ivy's statement. The spontaneous details, the child-appropriate language, the absence of adult-prompted framing, and explained why it bore all the hallmarks of genuine disclosure rather than rehearsal. The jury heard Ivy's recorded interview. They did not need to hear it twice. Wen had entered a plea agreement. She admitted to knowing about the abuse, to having seen signs she chose to explain away, to twice finding Ivy in the workshop when Nathan had told her the child was asleep. She said she had been afraid. She said she hadn't known how to leave. I sat in the courtroom and listened to her say those things and tried to hold two things at once, that fear is real and that a child paid for her silence with years of her life. I couldn't fully reconcile them. I still can't. She received 14 years. Her attorney called it excessive. The families of other victims, and there were others, which came out during sentencing, evidence of prior conduct that the prosecution was permitted to introduce, did not call it excessive. Nathan's trial lasted 9 days. He maintained his innocence through all of it, with a stillness that people in the gallery apparently found unsettling. His own mother, my mother, stopped attending after the 3rd day. She told me later that she couldn't watch his face while the evidence was being presented, that she kept looking for her son in it and finding a stranger. He was convicted on all counts. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Margaret Adler, who had been on the bench for 18 years, said at sentencing that the calculated and methodical nature of the abuse, the record-keeping, the deliberate construction of the space, the threats made to a child to ensure her silence, demonstrated a degree of premeditation that she found among the most disturbing she had encountered in her tenure. She sentenced him to 40 years with eligibility for parole review after 30. He is 41 years old. My parents sat in the back of the courtroom during sentencing. My mother held my father's hand the entire time. He had aged since July. They both had. I had started the foster certification process in September, 2 months after Nathan was arrested. The background check, the home study, the training hours, the interviews. It takes longer than people realize, and the waiting is its own kind of difficult. My apartment on Capitol Hill was assessed and approved with some modifications: a second bedroom that had been my office, a safety gate at the top of the stairs, outlet covers, a smoke detector in every room. In February, 8 months after that July 4th cookout, Ivy came to live with me. She arrived with a pink backpack and a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was a baby. A rabbit so worn that one of its ears was almost completely detached. My mother had packed the bag. Inside were her clothes, her favorite books, a framed photo of herself as a newborn that had always sat in her old bedroom, and a handwritten note from my mother that said simply, "She knows she is loved. Make sure she keeps knowing." Ivy stood in the doorway of what had been my office and was now her room, and looked at the bed I'd bought. the bookshelf I'd assembled, the string lights I'd hung along the window because she'd once told me she liked the way they looked. "Is this my room?" she said. "If you want it." She walked in slowly and looked at everything, touching the bedpost, running her fingers along the book spines. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at her feet. "What if I have a bad dream? Then you come knock on my door and I'll get up. What if it's the middle of the night? Especially if it's the middle of the night." She looked up at me. "Every time? Every single time?" She nodded. Then she picked up her rabbit and held it in her lap and was quiet for a while, and then she said she was hungry, and I said I'd made pasta, and she said, "Did I put broccoli in it?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Okay then." The first year was the hardest year of my life, and also the year I am most grateful for. Ivy had nightmares. Frequently. She had days when she could not go to school because leaving felt like falling. She had a therapist, Dr. Reyes, who she saw weekly, and a school counselor who checked in every morning. She had a way of testing me, not meanly, but quietly, in small daily ways, asking for something and then watching my face when I answered. What she was measuring, I think, was whether my expression would change, whether I would become someone else. I tried very hard never to become someone else. There was a day in April, about 2 months after she'd moved in, when Ivy was drawing at the kitchen table and I was grading papers nearby, and she looked up and said, "Uncle Ray, are you my dad now?" I put my pen down. "Not yet officially, but I'm working on making it official, if that's what you want." She thought about it. "What would I call you?" "Whatever you want." She turned back to her drawing. A few minutes later, she said without looking up, "I'm going to think about it." She thought about it for 3 weeks. Then one morning, she came into the kitchen and poured herself a bowl of cereal and looked at me across the counter and said, "I want to call you Dad." "Okay," I said. "Is that okay with you?" "That's more than okay with me." She nodded, satisfied, and ate her cereal. The adoption was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in November, almost 17 months after that cookout. Ivy was 6.5 by then, newly missing her 2 front teeth, wearing a dress my mother had picked out in navy blue with white collar that made her look like she was attending a very formal tea party. Judge Adler, the same judge who had sentenced Nathan, which felt significant to me even if it was mostly coincidental, presided. She asked Ivy if she understood what was happening. Ivy said yes. She asked Ivy if this was what she wanted. Ivy said yes, and then, unprompted, she said, "He makes pasta without broccoli." The courtroom laughed. Judge Adler smiled and said that was an excellent quality in a parent, and then she granted the adoption and shook Ivy's hand, which Ivy found very impressive because she'd never shaken a judge's hand before. Ivy is 8 now. She still sees Dr. Reyes once a month instead of weekly. She plays soccer on Saturday mornings with a ferocity that makes me want to apologize to the other teams. She has a best friend named Juno who sleeps over sometimes, and they stay up too late and I pretend not to notice. She's learning to read chapter books and will tell you at length, at any given moment, about the relative merits of various dragon species in her current favorite series. She is loud and opinionated, and occasionally maddening, and I cannot imagine my life without her. She still has nightmares sometimes. She still checks rooms when she enters them. Still does the quiet, careful sweep of her eyes that I first noticed at that cookout. Dr. Reyes tells me this may fade over time, and it may not fully, that her nervous system learned things early that take a very long time to unlearn. I try to be patient with that. I try to understand that healing isn't linear and doesn't have a finish line. Nathan is at the Lyman Correctional Facility, about 2 hours east of Denver. He has filed 2 appeals. Both were denied. I don't think about him as much as I used to. The first year, he was in my head constantly, a mixture of grief and fury that I didn't know what to do with, because grief and fury aren't supposed to occupy the same space, and yet they do. My therapist, yes, I got one, calls it ambiguous loss, the mourning of someone who still exists but is no longer who you thought they were. Maybe who they never were? The distinction doesn't fully matter. My father died last spring. Heart failure, which had been coming for a while, though it still didn't feel like it was coming until it arrived. His last coherent conversation was with Ivy, who sat with him in the hospital and told him about her soccer team and the dragon books and a science project about volcanoes she was working on. He listened to the whole thing and then he took her hand and said, "You're going to be just fine, you know." She told me later she believed him. I believe her. There are things I could have noticed sooner. I've been over the calendar in my head 100 times. The months before that cookout, the visits where Ivy seemed slightly less herself each time, the moments I attributed to phases, to shyness, to whatever parents say when they're explaining a child's behavior to themselves. I've made peace with most of it. Not all of it. Some guilt doesn't metabolize completely. Dr. Reyes tells me this is normal. I try to accept normal. What I know for certain is this. A child told me something in a hallway, in a voice barely above a breath, and I believed her. That's it. That's the whole thing. She told me the truth and I believed it, and I acted on it, and every single consequence of that, the hard ones and the good ones and the ones I'm still living inside of, was worth it. If you're reading this and there is a child in your life who has gone quiet, who flinches, who checks over their shoulder before they speak, please pay attention to that. Please don't talk yourself out of what your instincts are telling you. Children don't have the language for what's being done to them. What they have is behavior, and behavior is a language, and it is worth learning to read. You don't have to be certain. You just have to make the call. In the state of Colorado, you can report suspected child abuse to the Colorado Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline at 1-844-CO-44-KIDS. It's free, it's available around the clock, and you can report anonymously. If you believe a child is in immediate danger, call 911. I am not a hero. I'm a high school history teacher from Aurora who loved his niece and couldn't sleep. That's all it took. That July, Ivy and I finally went looking for fireflies. We drove out to Chatfield State Park at dusk and walked down to the reservoir with the mason jar, and we stood in the tall grass at the edge of the water as the light went low and the first one started to flicker in the reeds. Ivy grabbed my hand. "There," she whispered. "I see it. Don't scare it. I'm not moving." "You're breathing loud. I'm trying to exist." She giggled at that. A real giggle, sudden and unguarded, the kind that surprises the person making it. She looked up at me right after, a little startled by her own laugh. And then she smiled. Not the careful smile she'd had for a long time, but a full one, with all her missing teeth showing. We caught 6 fireflies that night. We let them all go before we went home. The jar still sits on the windowsill in her room. Empty now. She keeps it there on purpose. I asked her once why she kept an empty jar. She thought about it for a second and then said, "Because we know what goes in it." I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that July 4th. Not in any grand cosmic sense. I don't believe the universe was arranging things for or against anyone. I think about it more plainly than that. I think about how every choice anyone made in this story, mine included, had a specific consequence that couldn't be undone once it was set in motion. Nathan made choices. Calculated, deliberate, sustained choices over years against a child who had no ability to protect herself. He built a system designed to survive his own family scrutiny. He knew what he was doing was wrong. The locked door, the sealed windows, the threats he placed into a 5-year-old's mouth like stones. None of that is the behavior of someone who doesn't understand consequence. He understood it precisely. He just believed the consequences would fall on everyone else. Gwen made choices too. Smaller, quieter ones, spread across months. Choosing not to ask. Choosing to accept the explanation. Choosing her own fear over Ivy's safety again and again. Until the choosing became habit and the habit became complicity. And I made choices. I chose to sit down next to a quiet child at a party when I could have gotten another beer. I chose to crouch down in a hallway and say "you can tell me" to a little girl who had been taught that telling was dangerous. I chose to go back to that house even though everything in me understood what finding something would mean for my family. The reason I talk about this as cause and effect isn't to make it sound mechanical or to pretend there's some tidy logic that makes terrible things acceptable. It's because I think we often underestimate how much weight ordinary choices carry. We think the significant moments announce themselves. They don't. The moment that changed everything for Ivy didn't feel like a pivotal moment. It felt like sitting in a lawn chair next to a quiet kid at a cookout, wondering if I was imagining things. What I've come to believe is that character isn't what you do when the stakes are obvious. It's what you do when you're not sure the stakes are real yet, when you could still reasonably talk yourself out of it. When acting means blowing up your family, and not acting means everything probably stays surface level fine. That's the actual test, not the dramatic one, not the one where the right answer is clear. The one where you have to decide what you're willing to live with. Ivy asked me once, when she was about 7, why I had gone to the workshop that day. She didn't ask it like she was looking for a particular answer. She asked it the way kids ask things, when they're genuinely trying to understand how the world works. I told her the truth. I said I wasn't sure I was right. I said I went because I couldn't stop thinking about her face and because the cost of being wrong about going was smaller than the cost of being wrong about staying away. She thought about it for a second and then said, "That makes sense." That's the whole lesson, if there is one. Not bravery in the Hollywood sense. Not certainty. Just the willingness to absorb the cost of being wrong in the direction of protecting someone who can't protect themselves. That's a choice available to anyone. It doesn't require a particular job or a particular personality. It just requires deciding that a child's safety is worth more than your own comfort, more than family loyalty, more than the social contract that says we don't ask hard questions at cookouts. Ivy keeps an empty mason jar on her windowsill. She told me she keeps it because she knows what goes in it. I think about that more than she probably realizes. What you fill things with is a choice. So is what you leave room for.